Well, could I welcome everyone to this, what I'm sure will be an absolutely fascinating event. My name is Wayne David. I'm the Member of Parliament for Caerphilly, and until very recently, I've been the Shadow Minister speaking for the Labour Party on the Middle East and North Africa. This afternoon's discussion is focusing on contested citizenship, understanding national identity in the Middle East and North Africa. And that strikes me as an incredibly apposite and relevant discussion, because it's some 10 years ago since we've had the Arab Spring, the Arab Uprisings, beginning in Tunisia and spreading across North Africa and much of the Middle East. And many people thought that this heralded a new era, a flowering of democracy. But in many cases, in most cases, I think what we have seen is a retrenchment, really, and the traditional conflicts between rulers and ruled have continued. But at the same time, we've seen new tendencies, new trends emerging at the same time. We've seen great complexity, I think, in a whole myriad of countries across the region. And I think that, if we look at those countries, what we see is renewed conflict taking different forms. We've seen the emergence of a new kind of extremism, perhaps, but at the same time, we've seen public discontent being very apparent and itself taking a whole variety of different forms. And I think in that context, the discussion about what sovereignty actually means and what citizenship means and what is national identity in this context is very, very important. And to have that discussion and to delve into these complexities, we have four very eminent speakers with us. Firstly, we have Professor Simon Mabon, we have Dr. Noor Abu Asab, we have Professor Noura Lori, and we have James Verini. And I'm going to ask each of the speakers to speak for around about 7 to 8 minutes. And then when the four speakers have spoken, I will encourage discussion and questions to be placed through the chat box. And our first contributor is Professor Simon Mabon. He's the director of SEPAD, which is the project for sectarianism, proxies and De-sectarianisation. Quite a mouthful. And he is also the director of the Richardson Institute for Peace, which is the UK's oldest peace and conflict research centre. He has widespread research experience and is an expert on the intersection of international political theory and Middle East studies. So I think he's an ideal person to begin our discussion. And Simon, I'd very much like to hand over to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Wayne. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming along to this event. It's wonderful to see so many names rather than faces, I guess, but see so many names here. I'd just like to thank our fellow panelists and Adam Hogg and Poppy and everyone at the Foreign Policy Centre for pulling this together. This is a really important topic, and one that we in SEPAD, we tend to use the acronym, Wayne, rather than spelling out the full title, just for ease. It's something that we're becoming increasingly interested in as a way of understanding the position of sectarian identities within political life. And it's something that we're exploring in a number of different projects, and with an event on Thursday and Friday, a conference, in fact, where I'm delighted to say that one of my fellow panelists, Professor Noura Lori, will be giving a keynote lecture. And I'll put a link in the chat to that if anyone is interested in hearing more about these questions of citizenship and belonging and inclusion and national identity. But what I'll do in my few minutes is just set up a few general general thoughts about citizenship within the context of a state. My wonderful co-panelists have got some really rich empirical and philosophical details to offer. But I thought that what I could perhaps do is just contextualize the role of citizenship and belonging within a state. And for the Arab philosopher Ibn Khaldun, politics is fundamentally concerned with the survival of the species. It's concerned with the ways in which people are seeking to ensure their survival in the face of myriad different challenges, and is concerned with the ways in which life is regulated. Now, if we extrapolate that from the time that Khaldun was writing to the present day, we see that the state is the contemporary form of political organization. So states are fundamentally concerned with ensuring the survival of the species. But with it come a whole host of different challenges, come a whole host of different issues that those responsible for governing, for the regulation of life, need to address. This survival of the species involves the identification, the mitigation of different threats. And that requires addressing these challenges through a manner of different technologies of control, mechanisms of power, of governance that are bound up within the very idea of a state project. But these questions about threat, challenges, and efforts to ensure the survival of the species in the face of all these different challenges is fundamentally concerned with questions about inclusion and exclusion. This idea of a demarcation of a community. Who is included? Who is excluded? Where does the threat emanate from? What are the relationships between those who are included? What are the relationships with those who are excluded? How do you draw the lines between those who are included and those who are excluded? And here, there's a lot of work, philosophical work done by the likes of Hannah Arendt and others about the importance of inclusion within a political community. I'll just give you a quick quote here. The sense that no political community is imaginable that does not close itself off as an inside over against an outside. And so a political community is essentially defining itself by virtue of what it is not. And then from that, it regulates itself through legislation. It creates a space in which it is valid. And this space is the world in which we can move in freedom. And so this sense of creating these lines of inclusion and exclusion defines the nature of a threat, defines the nature of the challenge to the survival of the species, and it creates this sense of belonging. It creates a space in which a world takes meaning. And there's some interesting parallels between what Arendt was writing about in the 1950s and Ibn Khaldun several hundred years later, the sense that that life gains meaning. The world, in fact, gains meaning through interaction, through closing off, through creating these processes of governance and inclusion. And fundamental to this work and to much of the other canon on political philosophy is that the world gains meaning through interaction. World gains meaning, and politics gains meaning through interaction. But if we're accepting that, then whose meaning? What meaning matters? Who defines the meaning? We see tensions between rulers and ruled. We see tensions between formal rules and normative, informal rules. These play out in questions of citizenship. They play out in questions of politics more broadly. The spirit of the rule and the letter of the rule, for instance, is something that we see. We've seen that raised in the UK in recent days with regard to particular photographs. But I think this is really important because when we're talking about inclusion and citizenship, there are a lot of complexities at play. We're dealing with the closing off of a political community and then the inclusion of a body of people within a state. But not all of those people are necessarily citizens. And so even within that process of inclusion, you get hierarchies. You get citizens and non-citizens. And the ability to define who is a citizen, who is not a citizen, but still who is included, is a process of regulating life. It's a means through which social order can be imposed. If we look at the history of Iraq, for instance, across the 20th century, we see countless examples of particular groups being included within the fabric of the state and others being excluded from the fabric of the state, but yet still being contained within the broader definition of an Iraqi national. And so that process of drawing inclusive lines and exclusive lines is a fundamental part of politics. It's a fundamental part of the ways in which life is regulated. And what we see, particularly after the Arab Uprisings that Wayne was just alluding to, is the manipulation of these processes, and a quite visceral manipulation of these processes through revocation of citizenship, a fundamental exclusion of those that were previously included. And this is typically deployed as a mechanism of control, a means of resolving tensions between different identities and loyalties. At the time of the Arab Uprisings, there was a great deal of uncertainty about the relationship between rulers and ruled, about the quote-unquote social contract in a number of different states, amidst demands for change in the organization of political life and improvements to socioeconomic conditions, political reform. And that scared a lot of rulers. After the Arab Uprisings, Gulf states amended legislation to allow for citizenship revocation through recourse to anti-terror legislation or nationality laws. And this is perhaps best seen in the case of Bahrain. In Bahrain, between 2012 and 2019, 985 Bahrainis had their citizenship revoked. This was predominantly a means of stifling dissent, of preventing unrest, amidst a broader campaign of securitizing, framing as an existential threat of Shia communities in Bahrain, drawing parallels between Shia communities, Shia political parties who had been elected in many cases, and Iran, of nefarious Iranian manipulation of the Bahraini political scene. It was framed in security terms. And as a consequence of that security threat, the king and the ruling Al Khalifa family decided that the revocation of citizenship was a necessary tool to stifle dissent and to eradicate a particular threat. The revocation of citizenship was a necessary step in order to ensure the quote-unquote survival of the Bahraini species. Now, in 2019, the king reinstated citizenship for 551 individuals, but the damage was done. It was illegal to be stateless in Bahrain. Those who had their citizenship revoked faced prosecution for staying in Bahrain illegally, even though their families were there, their homes were there. They were then deported. This has serious implications for their children, for their families, for their mental health, for their physical health. And this all stems from a desire to ensure survival of a regime and to maintain power, to regulate life and impose a certain degree of order. And so citizenship, whilst replete with normative assumptions, is also a hugely important tool in the weaponry of authoritarian regimes. That ability to define who is a citizen and who is not, and to revoke citizenship, is an essential tool for those wishing to maintain power. And I think we need to understand that and understand the conditions that give rise to it. But I think my colleagues are far better placed than I to do that. So I think I should leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Thank you. That's a very interesting theoretical and also a very, very practical and political assertion towards the end, really, about the situation, I think, particularly in Bahrain, which many people are concerned about. Our next contributor is Dr. Noor Abu Asab. She is the co-founder and co-director at the Center for Transnational Development and Collaboration. And Noor describes herself as a queer Palestinian feminist sociologist, has a number of publications around identities, sexualities, migration, post-colonialism, and methods of decolonizing. And I'm sure she'll make an excellent contribution to our discussion this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for sharing this. And thanks to the Foreign Policy Center as well for organizing this event. I have a PowerPoint just because it gives me structure as I speak, but don't worry. It will not be overwhelming. It will not be so overwhelming. So basically, I think I will start with saying that maybe my conceptualization of politics is slightly different from Simon's and Ibn Khaldun's. And I see politics as the practice of power, not necessarily limited to state institutions, but it's also the practice of power, the way we practice power, the way in our relationships, in our daily lives, and in our everyday. What I would like to start, I mean, I want to bring the topic a little bit home in relation to contested citizenships and remind you of Priti Patel's, it's called the Nationality and Borders Bill, which passed through the House of Commons in the United Kingdom last week, which basically allows the government to take away citizenship for naturalized citizens and also for people who hold British citizenship who were born outside the country. So I think what I would like to speak of today is more around the transnational politics of citizenships, what it means, our relationship to the state, and what the state institution represents as well. Within, I will be reflecting on the Middle East, but I think we need to move beyond the exceptionalism of the Middle East in a way. So first, I would like to start with this quotation from Cohen, who says, "The nation state is often too large and too amorphous to be the object of intimate affection. Bonds of language, religion, culture, and a sense of common history, and perhaps common faith impregnate a transnational relationship and give it to an effective, intimate quality that formal citizenship or even long settlement frequently lacks." And this also builds on what others have said, such as Weber, who said, "The state is," and described the state as a compulsory political organization with continuous operations, as its administrative staff successfully upholds the claim to monopoly of legitimate use of physical force in the enforcement of its order. The authority of its administrative staff is claimed as binding within a territorial area, and this claim is upheld by force. So we see in the Middle East and also elsewhere across the world that the state monopolizes force and monopolizes physical power through which it can govern. And the state also, as Zubaydah puts it in relation to the Middle East, exists due to the lack of any other respectable models of governance. So the whole idea of the state, it's there because we don't have other alternatives, because we have not thought about a different ordering of the world. And if we want to think about the Middle East, states in the Middle East are machines of oppression. They constitute a continuation of colonization. The rulers and the rulers of the Middle East are actually the administrators of the colonies that were left by the British and also the French. And within these machines of oppression as well, there is a push for conformity, unity, as well, uniformity as well, that does not necessarily resonate with the identities, the different identities that exist within such states. And based on that, I feel that continuation of colonization is actually what the state in the Middle East is. Because as I said, the rulers are the administrators of the colonies. It is cheaper, of course, to exploit resources without military presence, making the region itself has been made the main market for the arms trade, sustaining countries in the global north, including the UK and the US and others. And people are literally born homeless without access to land, property, and or resources. And the state has also changed our relationship to land and the way we relate to each other. It's also what the state means to me, especially in the Middle East. It's also a way of organizing around imagined communities that govern our relationships to each other. It's also an enslavement within state systems under the guise of modernity. In social practice, ordinary citizens not only are arbitrarily deprived of some of their basic rights, but are the virtual prisoners of the states, the objects of its capricious and ever-presenting violence. And of course, we always need decolonial projects, and I believe transnational projects as well, to be able to counter that state monopoly over force and over power. And by decolonial projects, I mean here projects that do not reinforce romanticized discourses of authenticity and tradition, but rather involve processes of unlearning through which we shift the focus from identities to decolonial feminist and or native histories, indigenous understandings of gender, sexuality, desire, love, emotionalities, relationalities, and self-care as community care. And these decolonial projects, of course, prompt us to start thinking through a systems thinking approach. Rather than blaming the individual, we need to start blaming the whole system, and I talk about the global system. Because centralizing structural political systems and problems in our attempts to understand injustice, not only in the region, but also at a global level. I need water, sorry. And this basically involves exposing direct and indirect complicities with structures of oppression. This could involve exposing the arms trade, militarized human rights, and briefcase international development paradigms, medical, pharmaceutical, and punitive industrial complexes, as well as daily corporate elite control over basic rights such as food and shelter in the service of capitalist interests, among others. And we also need, I feel, intersectionality and transnationalism altogether. And what I mean by this is we need to start using intersectionality as a powerful decolonial analytical tool, particularly if and when used to build on transnational solidarities. Understanding intersecting systems of oppression operating at the global level, causing people to have differential, disidentifying the subversive and dissident experiences, realities, truths, positionalities, and access to resources. This also means centering, building transnational solidarities and collaborations without universalizing experiences, compromising intersectionality, and compartmentalizing and appropriating struggles. So, and what this also means is we need to be aware of our transnational interconnectivities, and we need to start creating global cultures of accountability. So, and I will quote Cynthia Kaufman because I think this is an excellent quote. If we ask ourselves the most simple questions, such as, where do we get our food from? We can see that we are tied up in networks of relationships with millions of other people. Our actions are constantly creating, recreating, challenging, and transforming the networks of relationships that make up the fabric of our shared world. We influence the fabric of society by the choices we make about whose actions we choose to acknowledge and whose we choose to ignore, by where we take a stand and where we choose not to, by how we treat others and how we expect to be treated. And with this, I also would like to invite, this is an invitation to everyone in the audience as well as the speakers, to think of ourselves and our different identities as processes that are inevitably influenced by others through intimacies and emotionalities, as well as through oppression and abuses of power. To acknowledge that our identities everywhere, whether that's national identity or ethnic or sectarian identity, are dynamic, relational processes and are necessarily bound in time and space. I would also like to invite you to acknowledge that we have multiple belongings, relationships, and affinities, such as those related to attachments to loved ones, to land, to place, to memories, to people, to institutions, to experiences, to symbols, to stories, to the spiritual and to the supernatural, which is often left out of conversations. And most importantly, to our multiple selves and multiple identities. In this, there is also an invitation to queer our understanding of the world as we know it, in order to become able to collectively articulate it as we want it, and to imagine it differently, and to open up for our imaginations for an alternative world. Thank you. I think I'll stop here.
Right. Well, that was quite a vision you set forward, a fundamental change and a reorientation of our focuses and the creation of international mechanisms, global mechanisms of accountability. That's quite an agenda you touched upon, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Wayne.
Our next contributor is Professor Noura Lori, who is the Assistant Professor of International Relations at the Pari School of Global Studies at Boston University. She focuses her research on citizenship and migration and helped create urban refuge, an aid mapping app for refugees. Noura is originally from Bahrain. I'm sure she found Simon's comments very, very interesting, and was in the Middle East conducting research when the pandemic began. Professor Noura Lodi, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for including me in this conversation, and for the other panelists for really, I think setting a really large agenda that's both theoretically and empirically sophisticated. So I will just make a couple of different comments about trying to put the Middle East and North Africa in a more comparative perspective, and just think about it as a major migrant receiving, transit, and sending region in the world. So I'll divide the comments into migration policies, citizenship policies, and what that means for citizenship outcomes or migrant incorporation outcomes. And I want to argue that actually when it comes to thinking about the region, we have quite inclusionary immigration policies, which is distinct from saying inclusionary citizenship policies. We have inclusionary migration policies that are combined with then quite exclusionary citizenship regimes. And when it comes to outcomes, that means that even though we host large numbers of migrants, we don't necessarily have strong pathways for giving people long-term security or access to political, economic, social rights. And so, when it comes to just looking at the Persian Gulf states, the Arab Gulf states, that's already, and just the labor migration there, that's already the third largest migrant receiving region in the world after North America and Western Europe. Now, when you add all of the labor migrants, and thinking again, this is a massive shock over a period of 50 years, the Gulf's aggregate population increases tenfold. And now you have in places like the UAE or Qatar, a much higher percentage of non-citizens to citizens, with 90% of the population made up of immigrants. So just looking at the Gulf alone, major migrant receiving region, also some of the highest concentrations of immigrants in the world. Now, if you also include hosting refugees, then it really becomes clear that the Middle East and North Africa is the largest migrant receiving region in the world. So not only are we do you have major transit states like Morocco, Libya, et cetera, they're also migrant sending states, but also the largest host states for refugees, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan. These are major, really important nodes in the global framework for refugees. And so what this means is kind of coming back to this idea of having inclusionary kind of migration policies, but them being connected with exclusionary citizenship regimes. We do have really expansive systems for hosting labor migrants and also for hosting humanitarian migrants, but that hosting is not combined with pathways for inclusion. And instead, what we see with the citizenship regimes is a real focus on jus sanguinis, so citizenship by blood. And when you have decolonization, many of these states also define citizenship as Arab, even though we have lots of non-Arab minorities. So already from the design, you have some exclusionary practices that emerge with just defining through these constitutions, these new states as Arab states. But on top of that, these tend to be not just citizenship by blood, also patrilineal citizenship regimes, which means that women cannot give citizenship. There's five states in North Africa and Middle East that do allow women to provide citizenship for their children. But for the most part, we see real restrictions in this arena, and that has led to systematically forms of displacement and outright statelessness. And so again, kind of taking it back to thinking expansive citizenship regimes, but inclusionary, but very exclusionary citizenship regimes means that the outcomes are unclear. And I would say that when it comes to migrant incorporation outcomes, and I would say instead of thinking about are immigrants in the region sort of excluded, I think it's really powerful to think about conditional inclusion and forms of precarious citizenship. And for that, I'm thinking about, it really is, you know, this may sound a little theoretical and out there, so bear with me, but I think of this as thinking about migration enforcement through time as opposed to space. And so we're so used to thinking about migration enforcement through space, which borders, external borders, interior borders, and stopping people from becoming parts of the political community by virtue of preventing them from entering a territory. And I think that that's one way of restricting borders. Another way of thinking about migration enforcement is through temporal strategies of exclusion. And by this, what matters is not how much time individuals reside in a state, but how that time is then converted into rights. And so by pegging different legal statuses to different kinds of rights, you can delay or suspend access to citizenship, or on the other hand of the equation, speed it up with things like citizenship by investment schemes. So what do I mean by saying you delay or suspend access to citizenship? This is where we look at temporary legal statuses. And so temporary guest worker systems count people as temporary, even though we know that often this becomes a permanent form of residence. And this is, I think, applicable to all of the GCC states where we have really large proportions of non-citizens who we count as temporary, but who've actually been there over generations and find ways of living in the Gulf. So that doesn't mean that they're temporary, it means that they're permanently deportable. And so that's one kind of way of thinking about time and migration enforcement. And I would say that the Gulf is an extreme articulation of this, but we see these temporary admissions and temporary visa policies kind of globally. I'm talking to you from Boston, so I'll just say within the US system, for example, 60% of visa categories are technically non-immigrant, which means your time doesn't count towards permanent residency or citizenship, right? So F1, student visas, all of these other kinds of visa categories, your time doesn't count towards citizenship. But when it comes to taxation, time is time. After 5 years, you're gonna get taxed as a US citizen. So that's why I think it's really important to think about these legal statuses as being strategic and use of time as being a really key way of thinking about enforcing borders. So you have temporary worker authorization, but then again, thinking about the Middle East and globally, because the refugee resettlement regime is so restrictive and it's actually really hard to get access to asylum. I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about why that is, and that's kind of virtue of the way the system has been designed under the Refugee Convention. Individuals can only get access to asylum if they can prove individualized persecution, but the reality is people are displaced for a whole range of reasons, outright conflict, climate change, et cetera, that doesn't count as individualized persecution. And so for most states in the world that host refugees, we've seen the proliferation of these kinds of ad hoc and temporary humanitarian statuses. And so Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, all of these states host large numbers of refugees, but often under these kinds of temporary protection statuses that allow people to reside. Again, so it's not, this kind of spatial control of not letting people in a country, allowing people to reside, but with partial and conditional rights in the same way as you see with temporary labor programs. Temporary humanitarian statuses are another kind of trend we see globally that's very important in the Middle East. So again, why does this matter for then migrant incorporation outcomes? It matters because it's how we count time under the mantle of the law. And so even if you have people who've resided in refugee camps or in other places over generations, they're not, the citizenship laws are designed in such a way that if you're under a temporary status, you're not eligible for citizenship. And so this is where I think it's important to think about not just outright exclusion, but conditional forms of inclusion. And that really applies to people who find themselves in these kinds of temporary statuses for very long periods of time. And lastly, and I'll stop here because I know I've been speaking for a while, is thinking about outcomes. Not only do you have temporary statuses, you also have statelessness as an outcome of this mismatch between more expansive immigration hosting and exclusionary citizenship regimes. And by that, I mean, if you think about the way that the citizenship regimes are defined, if you cannot prove that you're of an Arab stock in some places, then it becomes really hard to find citizenship or to attain citizenship. And that's something I look at in the UAE in my book, Offshore Citizens, but it's not just in the UAE. If you look at all of the Gulf states, you have citizenship laws that require you to trace your lineage to particular Arab tribes that often extends prior to the formation of the state. So in the case of the UAE, the state is formed in 1971, but you have to trace your lineage through these family books to Arab tribes of 1925. So you have people who just don't fit from that perspective. But then, and they can become stateless. This is compounded by the fact that women cannot pass citizenship on to their children. So if you're married to someone who's stateless, or even if you're not, if you're married to someone who also comes from having a jus sanguinis or citizenship by blood regime, you can have these different mismatches where people just aren't counted by any given state and end up being stateless. Another reason we see statelessness emerging kind of systematically through these citizenship regimes is because it can be really hard to register births if you're displaced. And often that is also about policing women's bodies and policing things like marriage, and having children out of wedlock can also lead to statelessness. So to kind of sum up, I think it's kind of wrong to say that this is a part of the world that doesn't host migrants. It's actually in some ways the most important migrant receiving region of the world, in addition to being a major transit region and also sending region. But the way that the citizenship laws have been defined and formalized has actually meant that you have systematically this kind of precarious access to citizenship where people are residing legally with these different kinds of temporary statuses that prevent them from becoming full citizens by design. So I'll stop there and say that I'm looking forward to the conversation with the remainder of the panelists, and also really for the Q&A. So I see we have a pretty big audience, and I'm looking forward to engaging with you.
That's great. Thank you very much indeed. I think you've touched upon a number of important issues, particularly statelessness and the factors which contribute to that, and not just the actual contemporary problems that we face, but how many of them are historically rooted and lead to the situation we have now. So thank you very much indeed for that. Our final contributor is Mr. James Verini. He's a features writer at the New York Times Magazine and specializes in coverage of war and conflict, and is the distinguished author of They Will Have to Die Now, Mosul and the Fall of the Caliphate. His journalism has also appeared in National Geographic Magazine, The New Yorker, Foreign Policy, and elsewhere. And it gives me very great pleasure, therefore, to ask James to address us as the fourth of our contributors. Thank you, James. Thank you.
Thank you. I should emphasize I'm the least knowledgeable contributor here. I'm not an Arabic speaker. I'm embarrassed to say, nor a Farsi speaker, nor even a French speaker. And my experience is very different. I rely a great deal on scholarly work for my articles, and in particular for my book about ISIS and Mosul. But as the panelists will know, there's a great deal of essential scholarly work on these issues in Arabic that has never been translated into English or other languages, which is not part of what I've looked at, I'm sad to say. But with that caveat, so my experience is different, a bit different. I spent nearly a year in Iraq writing about the war against the Islamic State, and particularly the Battle for Mosul, which was the climactic battle of that war. But I spent a lot of time all over in Iraq, Fallujah and Tikrit, and Iraqi Kurdistan, all of the places that had been taken over by ISIS. I was able during that time to speak to Iraqis and the subjects of my book about many other things besides ISIS. And one of the interesting things about the Islamic State was that it represented a sort of apotheosis or a climax in recent history in the Arab world, but also centuries old history in the Arab world. And all of the Iraqis I met, the adults and children alike, whenever I discussed the Islamic State with them, and oftentimes it was to ask them about why they had allied themselves with the Islamic State, which is extremely common. We tend to forget just how common it was, or we don't know. They always talked about history. They always talked about recent history, Sykes-Picot and Saddam, but their interest in history always stretched much farther back than that, back to Saladin and the Ottoman Empire. So I guess I'd like to begin there. I'd like to pick up on something that Simon mentioned. He singled out Iraq and its history in the 20th century with exclusionary politics and basing belonging and citizenship on sectarianism. And also I'd like to reference something Noor mentioned, ideas about citizenship in the Arab world and prejudices about citizenship coming largely out of colonialism. In fact, in Iraq at least, the debate over citizenship goes back well before the 20th century. It goes back at least to the early 19th century, when ideas about citizenship and belonging were first discussed and then passed as law in the Ottoman Empire. We have to remember that the Ottoman Empire, though it wasn't a Western colonial power, it was a colonial power as big as the world has ever seen in its way, as were the Persian empires against which it fought. And in the beginning in the 1820s at least, the Ottoman Empire the Sultan began to define citizenship largely in contrast to the Persian Empire, against which the Ottoman Empire was constantly fighting. This had to do with anxieties about empire, of course. It soon had to do with anxieties about Europe as well, because it wasn't long after that Europe began encroaching on Ottoman territories. The Ottoman ideas about citizenship in the early 19th century did not have a lot to do with sectarianism. They didn't have a great deal to do with religion, but they soon came to. The Ottoman rules about citizenship, which became increasingly strict and exclusionary over the course of the 19th century, they soon came to reflect the ongoing rivalry between Sunni and Shia that had been going on, of course, since the beginning of Islam, so that in the 1860s, the Ottoman Empire made it illegal for Arab men, Ottoman men, to marry Shia women, and the reverse. So over the course of the 19th century, Ottoman ideas about citizenship in the Ottoman Empire became increasingly sectarian. In the early 20th century, the Ottoman ideas about citizenship collided with Western colonial ideas about citizenship, particularly with Britain's aims with the Mandate. The first Iraqi citizenship law was passed in 1924. It was written by the British with the sign-off of Iraqi lawmakers, such as they existed at the time, and it was baldly exclusionary towards Shiites. The British in Iraq, like the British in Sudan, or the Belgians in Congo, or any colonial power, the British in Iraq favored Sunnis. They saw them as the way to rule the entire country and region. So that, ironically, King Faisal was able to be an Iraqi citizen, though he was not Iraqi, he was from Hijaz. But many Shia leaders were not allowed to be citizens of British-ruled Iraq. At the same time, ideas about citizenship in the 1924 law written by the Brits were formed by the Arab nationalist movement around what we now refer to as the Middle East, in Syria and Palestine and Iraq and in Lebanon and Iran. An Arab nationalist, and not just an Arab nationalist, a regional nationalist movement was occurring that, in Iraq at least, brought together Sunni and Shia clerics for a short time. Gertrude Bell, among other Brits who were very familiar with the region and spoke very good Arabic, she warned against the inclusion of Shias in the Iraqi state because she worried that it would create for a mujahideen government, which she called the very devil. So these, the anxieties about jihadism, as we would now call it, she called them mujahideen, go back as far as the 1920s as well. The person whom we associate with exclusionary politics, most of all in Iraq, is of course Saddam Hussein. And that's not a wrong-headed opinion. He really was dreadful, not just towards Kurds. He excluded Palestinians as well as others. He was particularly exclusionary towards Shiites. In Saddam's case, it was not unlike the Ottoman example. His exclusionary ideas began largely geopolitically. He began going after Shiite clerics because they represented a threat to the state, he thought, in Najaf and Karbala. When he invaded Iran in 1979, he began turning this exclusion of Shiites into a sectarian matter. As he became increasingly despotic, he increasingly referred to himself as not just an Arab ruler along the lines of Nasser, pan-Arab ruler, but also the savior of Sunni Islam. He thought about himself, or at least referred to himself, increasingly sectarian terms. And this also meant increasingly excluding Iraqis from citizenship and exiling them or assassinating them based on sectarian terms, based on the fact that they were Shiite and not Sunni. And the minority, the Shiite minority of Kurds, the Feli Kurds were perhaps the most discriminated against of any of the Kurds. This brings us to ISIS, which is my area of expertise so far as my expertise exists. ISIS was, in a way, the culmination of this anti-Shia exclusionary politics and exclusion from citizenship that had begun nearly 2 centuries earlier in the Ottoman Empire. The Islamic State is of course, absolutely genocidal in its view of Shiites in a way that no previous jihadist movement of its size was. Al-Qaeda was not this way. The Islamic State was absolutely dreadful in its thought towards Shiites, in part because the Islamic State, and this is something we tend to forget or don't recognize enough, was at its core a political movement. It was, of course, a religious movement. But more than that, I would say it was a political movement. It was a direct reaction to events in Iraq. The Islamic State did not start in Syria. It started in Iraq as a direct reaction to the American invasion and the government of Nouri al-Maliki. It also progressed from being geopolitical, or at least political, to increasingly sectarian as it became more successful, and then as it became less successful. And ISIS was a movement, a debate about belonging in Iraq and belonging in the Arab world, and beyond that, belonging in Islam. To ISIS, or at least to the fundamentalist hardcore of ISIS, there were many different levels in it. The Shiites were worse even than Jews or Christians. They're infidels, apostates, and they had no place in the Ummah. They had no place in the Islamic community, nor in the state of Iraq, nor in the Islamic State. Of course, ISIS said that it didn't recognize colonial form states such as Iraq or Syria, and that those borders were false. But nevertheless, it very much was an Iraqi movement, though it spread elsewhere. In a sense, ISIS, its ideas about belonging and citizenship in the Islamic State were very retrograde, in that they excluded one of the two major sects of Islam. But they were also ISIS's ideas about citizenship were in their way very futuristic. Not just because they did away with colonial borders, but because ISIS, so much of it was virtual. Its ideas of belonging and citizenship were virtual. They took place online and on social media as much as, or more than they did geographically within the Islamic State. So much of the discussion within the Islamic State, and so much of the bluster of the Islamic State, and so much of our notions of the Islamic State have to do with virtual belonging and not the physical presence of its citizens. In its way, it was also very accepting, in that to become a member of the Islamic State in Iraq or Syria, you didn't actually have to know anything about the Quran. You didn't have to know Arabic. You just had to pledge allegiance, essentially. And the idea was that once you came, or once you stated your belonging, everything else could be learned. This was particularly easy because, according to the Islamic State, there was no real history until the Islamic State. Even many, it discarded even many notions of people such as Ibn Khaldun, whom Simon mentioned. Anything else? Yeah, so in a sense, while the Islamic State was atavistic by definition and retrograde, it also had what we might call a sort of post-state or post-nationalist idea about belonging and citizenship. And it was rather brilliant in carrying this out in its way.
Thank you very much indeed, James. That is, quite a significant way to conclude the four contributions, I think, because your very last point about how ISIS, in a sense, transcended the traditional imposed national boundaries and traditional rigidity that has been imposed upon the Middle East in a quite different and, in many ways, horrific way. But a very, very interesting point to finish on. We've got one question which has been submitted, but I wonder if I could begin the discussion by asking all contributors, really. It seemed to me that it is very noticeable that in all 4 contributions, the state of Israel wasn't mentioned. But in many ways, the state of Israel is one of the biggest players in the Middle East. And one of the significant developments over the last year or so has been the construction of the Abraham Accords, the agreements between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and others. And a big emphasis is placed on those accords by Israel. And we've seen other countries like Saudi Arabia, especially, you know, and Jordan very, very recently been prepared to move closer to Israel and be prepared to not just normalize relations, but actually develop a closer relationship than we've ever seen before. And how significant is that trend to what you've been talking about, really, and the definitions of identity and citizenship, and what are the long-term implications for all the Arab nations of North Africa and the Middle East? Big question. Simon, would you like to have a go at that one?
There might be someone slightly better placed than me. Noah seemed like she was ready to come in, but is that right?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Wayne, for the question. And actually, I'm speaking to you today from Palestine, from Jerusalem. Palestine. I mean, we don't always have to explicitly mention the state of Israel. There is a theory by Bourdieu where he says, basically, if we keep talking about the states, then we are participating in their making. This is one way of looking at it. And the other way of looking at it, I mean, all of the conversation, I tried to switch the conversation towards colonization, and Israel is part of that colonization within the region that is very direct and very clear, and everyone can see it, unlike the type of colonization we see in other countries. And if you want to talk about the normalization of relationships, whether between, for example, the UAE, Saudis leaning towards the Jordanian government has been in a peace. Actually, they're in peace with Israel since 1994. So this is not a new phenomena. And if we look at it, I mean, what I would really like to push forward is people in the Middle East and countries in the Middle East and also nations within the Middle East are not represented by their rulers. So even though there is a tendency towards the UAE, I mean, there's an Emirati tendency to normalize relationships. This does not necessarily apply to its citizens or its inhabitants. And the same applies to Jordan, the same applies to Syria, the same applies to everywhere in the country. And the thing we're witnessing, in fact, is that we are really focusing on what the rulers do, and we really forget about the agency of the rule, what we as people can do, and how we can maneuver around these systems and negotiate them as well. And I echo what many feminists and women of color said, that in order to liberate ourselves from this system, the state system, the nation state system that is based on discriminatory ideas in the first place, we really need to find ways to live away from these systems or within them, but reducing our dependence on them at the same time, because they have historically, whether that is the states, they have historically marginalized people across the globe. And I'm not just talking about Palestine, I'm also talking about South Africa and also indigenous communities in the United States. So I feel colonization as an umbrella, or considering Israel as a settler colony, is the most appropriate. And I feel it's been addressed when we were talking about colonization as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Would someone else like to come in on that point? Because the question I have is for you as well, Dr. Abbas. Would someone like to come in and respond to that one?
I can. Oh wait, Simon. I think yes. You want to jump in, Simon?
I can hold my jump. It's okay. Please, Nora.
I was just going to say. I think Dr. Noor put it perfectly, and I just wanted to call attention to the global structure for responding to refugees and the fact that Palestinian refugees are outside of that global structure. So, you have UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is in charge of Palestinian refugees, whereas all other refugees in the world are aligned under or fall under the jurisdiction of UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And the reason we see that is because UNRWA actually precedes UNHCR. So it comes up in 1948, specifically to respond to this refugee crisis that emerges as a response to the formation of the State of Israel, whereas the Refugee Convention of 1951 is in many ways a response to the Holocaust. And so you have a global structure for responding to refugees that comes out of that paradigm, where really the way to get refugee status is to show that you're individually persecuted because of some aspect of your identity. And in addition to this kind of normalization of agreement, what we're seeing is that there isn't this concomitant kind of commitment to funding, increasing funding for UNRWA, or at least bringing Palestinian refugees within this larger global framework, an umbrella for protecting Palestinians. And so on the one hand, there's no real developments on the ground that are leading to more inclusive outcomes for Palestinians within Palestine. And on top of that, we've foreclosed the exit strategy. So you're really seeing this very problematic kind of containment effect, where you're telling people leave, but then there's no way for them to actually leave or go anywhere. And so when we think about Palestinians who are kind of doubly displaced, they're displaced first to places like Iraq and Syria, and then again, and we note that there's a huge protection gap that Palestinian refugees face because they're outside of this system of the UNHCR. And then finally, I'll just say that when it comes to excluding Palestinians, it's not just the State of Israel, it's other Arab governments that haven't given them citizenship rights. And sometimes that's used as a kind of lip service of, if we give Palestinians full citizenship rights, then they have no claims to Palestine. I think that's very strategic and a way to kind of prevent Palestinians from having full citizenship rights. And if we're thinking about the Gulf, I don't think yes, you have these Abrahamic Accords, but also thinking about the first Gulf War was really important because you had in places like Kuwait and Bahrain, across the Gulf states, after the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, there was a perception that the PLO, there's a specific picture, I think that was very famous, of Yasser Arafat kind of shaking hands with Saddam, PLO not condemning Saddam. And that led for Palestinians who were in the Gulf, who were integrated, who helped in Kuwait and elsewhere, who helped build really key parts of the civil service and education systems, were suddenly enemies of the state overnight, regardless of their actual stance on the conflict. And so I think that's, and then we see mass expulsions and denaturalizations of Kuwaiti Palestinians who've now been expelled, but Yemenis also, Iraqis also. So you have individuals who are, settled, have these relationships and are integrated, and then suddenly, regardless of their actual stances on these conflicts, become these scapegoats. And so I thank you for bringing up Palestine and Israel. I think it's a really huge issue that shows again how protracted these refugee crises are when we pretend that they are short term. So what does it mean to be on a temporary status over generations for the past 60 years? And that's what we're seeing happening to Palestinian refugees.
Thank you very much indeed. Simon, did you want to come in, or should we?
Yeah, just briefly, if I may, just to pick up on what Nora was saying and what Nora was saying, and linking back to what Nora was saying in her talk, I think time is really important. And I was just thinking of when I was in Nablus. I went to I was taken to one of the largest refugee camps in the West Bank, there, Balata, and that was formed in 1950. But I was told that the rights to the land on which 30 to 40,000 people live will be will erode, and they will cease to be officially operating within 100 years of its establishment. So you have this huge refugee camp that's established, sort of institutionally built, not a transient camp, but a camp in which people have built homes with concrete and sort of a semi-permanence of homes, but they're living in this position that is sort of in limbo, in a very precarious position. And there's an argument to say this is all about a delaying tactic. It's all about freezing people in this precarious position, this precarious position of time. Speaking with Palestinian Jerusalemite friends, they feel the same way about the status of themselves in East Jerusalem, this sort of freezing of their position, abandoned by the Israelis, caught in their Israeli laws, and sometimes also abandoned by the Palestinian Authority, who are seeking to impose their own sense of sort of legal ordering over the West Bank. So there is this real complex set of issues going on, and I think Noah's right about, yes, the Israelis have a huge amount to answer for, and Noah is right with her description of things. But there's also, I don't want to say a degree of complicity, because that's not in any way equivocation, but there are other actors who have failed to live up to their normative responsibilities with regard to Palestinian people, with regard to Syrian refugees, with regard to Iraqi refugees. Maybe the thing to say is people have failed people.
Yeah, personally, I think there's a heck of a lot in what you just said. Absolutely.
May I add something quickly?
Yes, please.
Just an interesting side note. I found attitudes towards Israel in Iraq not what you might expect them to be. There were people in Iraq who openly expressed their admiration for Israel, in particular the Kurds I met. I spent a lot of time with the Peshmerga, and they had a great deal of reverence for Israel as a place where these people had carved out a state and were able to defend themselves against their rivals. The Kurds were quite open about this with me. But even among Iraqis I met who had allied themselves with the Islamic State, or at least had abided it, there wasn't a contempt for Israel per se. There was an abiding, universal, pervasive anti-Semitism. They referred to me and every other American, not just as Americans, but as Jews. Anyone who was disliked was a Jew. And a Jew had come to mean not someone who even practiced Judaism. Jew had come to mean anyone they felt threatened by. But even among the jihadists and the people I met who had supported ISIS, there was clearly, there was a very conflicted attitude about Israel. And some of it was reverence and jealousy, frankly. It was for these people who had managed to, whom even the jihadists regarded as really tough and ruthless in a way that they wanted to be. And I think part of the jealousy and reverence also was to do with what they perceived to be Israelis' sense of self and sense of community. If you go to Israel, you learn very quickly that that coherence does not exist. The Israeli society is as at loggerheads and fraught as any other society. But there was this strange hypocritical notion of Israel and its coherence, and a certain reverence for that.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I would like to actually come in on this in particular, what James has spoken about with regards to Kurdish people expressing admiration for Israel. I mean, here in Palestine, you may hear Palestinians expressing admiration to Israel as a state that was based on force, but also we cannot separate these conceptualizations of, you know, this idealization of militarization from masculinity as well. And this is something that we need to bring into conversation. I mean, oftentimes, even like the worst of enemies, they like this muscle flexing and they like the showing off of power and physical force as well. This does not necessarily mean that this admiration is ideological. This does not necessarily mean that this admiration may lead to normalization with the Israeli occupation. And this also reflects a decolonization of minds, as Angela Davis puts it, because in the region, we've been through so many processes and historical processes of colonization that led to this colonization of minds among the populations. So some people, you would find a lot of dissonance among so many people in the region who would say, we admire Israel, but Israel is the enemy. Oh, we like the way the UK governs itself, but at the same time, we know that they're our colonizers. So this does not necessarily reflect an attitude of a leniency towards normalization necessarily, I think, James. And this is what I wanted to bring into the conversation.
That's a good point. I should emphasize that I never heard these opinions from women. Oftentimes, because as a male reporter, it's very difficult to interview women in the Muslim world. Their husbands or fathers don't like the idea of it, but also because honestly, the Iraqi women I spoke with who were candid with me and whose fathers or husband allowed them to talk to me, they were always much more open-minded and critically minded than their fathers or husbands. It's absolutely true, and that fathers and husbands, to put it much too simplistically, they had a reverence for power and force, which the women were sick of, frankly.
Okay, like I think we'll have to go on to have some of our guests asking questions, and we have a question from Jacob Eriksson, and it's a question for Dr. Abu Absab. He says, I really like the notion of a global culture of accountability, but who determines the rules, values of this global culture, and how is this done?
Okay, maybe I need to clarify what I mean by a global culture. It's not something that someone can accede to, and we cannot think about it as something that can be imposed either. So to start with this explanation, I think what I mean by a global culture of accountability is actually a push towards radical self-reflexivity. This is the term I would like to use, to start thinking about where we are positioned within structures of oppression, rather than thinking about a collective, identity around cultures of accountability, because we don't want to fall into the same trap of conforming, unifying, imposing specific identities, specific cultures. What I mean by a global culture of accountability is a process that we all need to be doing all the time in relation to our intimate practices, in relation to the food we choose to eat, in relation to what products I choose to consume, and also in relation to how I relate to the natural world and how I affect others through my actions, whether I'm in the UK or I'm in Palestine or I'm in South America. So this is what I mean by a global culture of accountability, rather than something that can be exposed or thrown or projected into populations, because we don't want to do the same thing. Like they called it Jordan and they decided to make the Jordanians. They called it Syria and they decided to make the Syrians. This is not what we want to see again. And another layer to what I meant by speaking against the state in general is we need to take anti-border stances as well. We need to stop thinking within the borders of the nation state. We need to start imagining worlds that can exist without necessarily imprisoning the nationals within the prison of the nation state. And we know by now that nationalism is a facade. Particularly, thank you, Noura, for what you bring in relation to migration, displacement, etc. This is very important because this is a massive challenge to what the nation state means. Because what we see now in the world, we can literally be in 2 countries at the same time. It's not, I mean, we live in a global village, and that global village needs to improve itself. And we need, as individual beings, to constantly hold ourselves accountable and improve ourselves through radical self-reflexivity. Hope that's clear.
Thank you very much indeed. And another question is from Drury Dyke. With regard to communities, organizations building bridges across the Abraham Accords, what are our Palestinian and Bahraini experts' views on a proposal of, say, human rights activists in both joining forces to oppose the human rights violations of the Israeli Palestinian Authority and Bahrainian authorities? I suppose it's a question about cooperation, really, to protect human rights with regard to the Palestinian authorities, Bahrainian authorities, and Israel. Professor Norrie, would you like to cover on that one, please?
I was actually going to try to make Simon answer this. Simon, do you want to jump in? I think you brought this up a little bit in your response.
Maybe, but
okay.
My response would be just to stress common humanity and common solidarities in terms of speaking out in favor of rights, respect, tolerance, calling out accountability, holding people to accountability, calling people out for all the things that you and Noor and others have flagged up here and in your work. I think that type of solidarity is what's called for. I think otherwise we start to risk getting bogged down in the intricacies and the divisions that immediately start to emerge when we get down into the weeds. And it's I'm sort of riffing on the spot here, Nora, thank you for that. But I think there is a shared humanity. There is a common sense of oppression in different forms, context specific. Bahrainis have experienced all manner of repressions across the past century, longer if you're Baharna. Palestinians have experienced their own oppressions. And in that sense, there is a common uniting thread. And speaking to that common thread of oppression, repression, there is something there. But it's very easy to pull that thread apart if you're not then speaking out against other types of abuses. And that, I mean, it's sort of reminding me of the silence of the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in China, for instance, and the allegations of hypocrisy by certain elites not speaking out against the treatment of the Uyghurs. But saying that, it's very easy for me to sit here in Lancaster as a white, middle-class, male professor and say we need to speak out on all these things from a very comfortable position of privilege. It's easy for me to say, but I think that thread of humanity is something that we should work towards. And just for what it's worth, speaking to Palestinian friends and Bahraini friends, they're already kind of doing it.
But I suppose the question is there a need for some sort of organization, some sort of body, some sort of international grouping which facilitates that and gives it a much stronger voice than the disparate voices which exist at the moment?
I think
these
organizations exist, Wayne, and they've existed for centuries now. And to be honest and to be fair, I mean, there are organizations that promote peace. You know, you have Seeds of Peace. You have so many things here in Palestine as well that promote this dialogue. But where it goes to is the problem. It's not the conversation itself that is, that is problematic. It's actually that we need to learn from others' mistakes as well. Why do we have to repeat the same mistakes? Because we know often with these normalizing events, or when an organization assumes that it's creating the dialogue across the Abrahamic religion. I'm sorry, but there are Jewish Palestinians who were expelled from Palestine in 1948. This is not a war over religion. This is not, we're also Semitic, like the Palestinians are Semitic as well. So this is basically a fight over land, property, and ownership and rights. It's as simple as that. There is no need to debate it. There is no need to converse around it. I mean, maybe traditional politics now, they want to distract us with all of the BS, I'm sorry for the word, with all of the BS and the language around it. But it's so clear. It's not complicated. It's really clear. We have a settler colony who expelled, we have more Palestinians abroad than we have Palestinians on Palestinian land. And we have a border problem across the region. We know this whole region was called Greater Syria at some point, and it went through so many different transformations and becomings. But we don't need to repeat the conversations that were already been done. We don't need to repeat the same conversations that Yasser Arafat did, and with a simple signature, he completely erased the refugees' right to return. We need alternatives, and this is and I mean, maybe, Al-Wifaq, sorry, because I read the question, maybe Al-Wifaq can speak to merits or whatever, but I really, really have doubts about where that conversation could go to. I know that it often goes to either pinkwashing, showing Israel as the ultimate democracy in the Middle East. It could also lead to blue washing as well, as if Israel is the most environmentalist country in the region. Could lead to so many other things. I don't know if we need to keep repeating the same mistakes.
Okay. Professor Laurie, do you want to come in on that, or should we move on?
I think we can move on. I think the panelists
Okay.
really, they hit it on the head.
Can I just make one addition?
Yeah, sure.
I would like to impugn my own profession in this regard. It's the business of newspapers and television stations and reporters to emphasize rivalry and dislike in the most simplistic ways. I don't really read many newspapers anymore, though I'm a magazine reporter, because the narratives are always so simplistic, and you don't, someone once said, you never read about a plane landing, right? You only read about planes crashing. And in the same way, you read about these rivalries, but when you go to any of these places, you realize it's much more complex, and there's often much more agreement and beneficence than you've been led to believe about any of these countries in conflict or regions supposedly in conflict.
Okay, I'll move on to one of the next questions. Nasser Eddin says, I would like to know what our speakers think about the growing weaponization of religion as a structural system of citizenship and nationality conception, exclusivism, and identity in general. I'm thinking about the North African countries and their Shia minorities as an example, or Jordan, where there is no official Shia worship place or recognized institution. Would anybody like to come in and focus on the discrimination which is being felt by many Shia minorities in some Arab countries?
I'll just say that there's nothing particularly new about it. I mean, this nation states and empires have been doing this for centuries and millennia. We're seeing it in more perhaps more official forms, but not even that. There's nothing the least bit new about this.
Thank you very much. I'm looking at my watch, and we are getting close toward our finishing time. So, James, you've just spoken. I'm going to ask each of the other three contributors if they'd like to say anything to round our discussion off. Perhaps I could start with Professor Laurie. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this question on sectarianism, the way I like to think about it is, yes, there's a durability to these identities and a durability to a kind of exclusionary impulse that we see across different political formations. But it's really important to ask, why are certain cleavages really salient at certain moments in time and then disappear at other moments in time? And I think that really comes comes back to what Dr. Noor was saying about power, that often we see, very strategic naturalizations, for example, to change demographic makeups, but those connections or which identities get privilege actually kind of change over time with changing really strategic interests. And so that's a very kind of broad way to think about sectarianism, but I think that in the same way that we're looking at these citizenship regimes, and the devil is really kind of in the details of how legal statuses are defined and what those mean in terms of full inclusion and rights. And you can see that whether we're talking about sectarian identity or something like national origin or bloodline. So I'll leave it there because I know there's only 2 minutes left and 3 other speakers, and just say thank you for a really enriching conversation.
Thank you very much indeed. Can we go to Dr. Abu Asrab?
Thank you, Wayne. Basically, I would like to conclude by saying thank you so much for the organizers. I know there's Adam, Hug, and Poppy as well. Thank you for putting this event together. I really enjoyed the conversations. It's been really great. I just want to address, there is someone who wrote something, Tariq Rajaf, on the Algerian citizenship. I have some material. You can access me through academia, and I'll send you the material on citizenship in Algeria. Finally, I'd like to say thank you, and I hope I see more of you in the future, all of you.
Excellent, thank you very much. And last but by no means least, Simon.
Thanks. Just to pick up on what Nora said very quickly, I think a really good example is post-2011 Bahrain, where we saw the revocation of citizenship of various opposition figures, predominantly at the start Shia groups, members of Al Wafaq and others, and also the widespread repression of Shia groups. But then as the situation changed, as the context in which the Al Khalifa and others were acting changed, as the power dynamics shifted, we saw that repression turn its focus to groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Salafi groups that had been so integral in ensuring the survival of the ruling family in the formative days and months and years after the uprisings of 2011. So time matters, space matters, context matters, and how power interacts with those things really matters. And citizenship, religion, various forms of identity, belonging, inclusion, exclusion, they're all ways and means of those in positions of power securing their power. And it's I think on us to try and identify those mechanisms and share the ways in which they operate to try and increase scope for accountability. But a huge thank you to everyone on the panel. It's been really wonderful. I've learned so much. Thank you so much, Wayne, for chairing this despite your challenge right now. And thank you to Adam, Poppy, and everyone in the room for coming along. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. I think it's been an excellent discussion, and my apologies for conducting this meeting on an iPad, and I'm in self-isolation as well. But it's been a very, very worthwhile discussion. I've certainly learned a heck of a lot from it too. And what's come across to me very, very clearly is the complexity of the situations we find ourselves in, and the importance of history to the contemporary malaise in many cases in which we find ourselves. And as Professor Laurie said, the devil is always in the detail, and that's very much an appropriate comment when we discuss in the Middle East and North Africa. But thank you all very much indeed. I'm sure our discussions will go on, and thanks in particular to SEPAD and the Foreign Policy Centre for organising this event. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.